What's up team? In this video I'm going to go over how I prepped my 07 STI 6-speed transmission for my GC project car. Now if you're not familiar with my project, go check out this playlist so you can get up to speed. Anyway, please note that this is prepping for the install. This is not the complete swap. I will show the entire process from transmission removal to DCCD wiring. I try my best to create detailed videos in a single video, but this swap may be too long and too much to digest in one video. So I think it's best to section out the process so I can give you the info you may need faster. And when it's all done, I will most likely create a playlist for the entire swap. And as usual, there are timestamps in the description for you to reference. Just click the blue numbers to jump to wherever you want to go. And if you're in a clicking mood, click to subscribe because this is good stuff. So there is something really important to note about an STI 6-speed swap into an early GD WRX or anything running that drivetrain. There are 4 major variations of this swap, and within those 4 there may be some options, so here's a brief overview. Number 1, a full STI swap. That's the transmission, axles, drive shaft, rear differential, hub assemblies, brake assembly, including the parking brake cables, suspension, and the DCCD harness, controllers, and STI instrument cluster. Number 2, the transmission, the STI or automatic drive shaft, an STI R180 rear differential, WRX axle stubs in the front, WRX axles in the front, hybrid WRX/STI axles in the rear, front and rear WRX brakes and suspension. Number 3, transmission, WRX axle stubs in the front, STI or automatic drive shaft, and everything else is WRX. Number 4, 2 or 3 with DCCD control system. There are several options for DCCD systems, so that's something that you can choose for your project. A DCCD setup has its own slot because you can run the 6-speed without DCCD. If your swap doesn't come with a DCCD system and you want one, you should add about another $1,000 to your budget because you will need to merge the wiring harnesses and at the very least get a DCCD controller, aka ECU. So the price can go up from there significantly. What I'm doing as of now is a number 3 coupled with a number 4 and a side of sauce. So in other words, I'm putting in a 6-speed, which inherently needs an STI or automatic drive shaft and a DCCD system. Everything else would be WRX, for now anyway. There are some tools that I suggest because they may make the work easier. For cleanup, you'll need shop towels, a catch pan, rust penetrant, silicone spray, dish soap and water or degreaser, soft scotch pad, a hard scotch pad, nylon or soft metal brushes, safety glasses, gloves, and a face mask or respirator if you polish like I did, because you do not want to breathe in those particles. And to lubricate the new or refreshed parts, you'll need gear oil for your seals, bearing grease for your fast moving parts, and silicone paste or whatever comes with your bushings for your bushings. To remove and install the mechanical parts, you'll need a small punch for the reverse lockout cable, a seal remover or double flathead screwdriver to remove the seals, a polymer dead blow hammer to knock in those stub axles, snap ring pliers for the shifter cup, and metric sockets and wrenches. The parts you will need is up to you because you can clean or replace everything or nothing. And I'm refreshing or replacing everything while I can because it's easily accessible. Okay, now let's get to the meat, the mechanical prep. I prefer to have the trans drained of fluid before removing or installing it. I won't refill it until the drivetrain is fully assembled. Doing this will avoid spillage from the axle and the output shaft seals. First, you want to inspect your input shaft for damage or play. These surfaces should be clean and smooth. Rub your fingers/fingernails along the surfaces to feel for nicks and imperfections. If there is a protrusion, you may need to get it professionally repaired or use a very fine file to smooth out the damage. These are bearing surfaces, so they need to be smooth. Now these splines should be clean and damage free. If any of the splines or grooves are damaged, twisted, bent, or broken, you might damage the clutch or other components. Wiggle the shaft back and forth to feel for excessive play. You will hear a little play in the gears on rotation, but it should be very slight. It's almost undetectable without the noise. The splines and bearing surfaces will need to be greased, but I don't like to do that until I'm ready to merge the engine and trans because you don't want debris to stick to your grease. Next, check the inside of the belt housing for signs of leaking fluid and cracks. Dirt helps detect leaks because it creates a stained pattern, so I suggest not cleaning the transmission until you inspect it. Now we're moving past the belt housing to the front differential area. There are 2 seals in this area for each side. One is for the axle and the other is for the differential access panel. That's 4 seals in total. I suggest replacing these and leaving these alone if they are not showing signs of leakage. The reason why I say leave these alone is because this component only needs to be removed if you need to access the front differential to service it. It is not a typical wear item. This component also sets preload for the diff, and this is a situation where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now for the axle seals, you can use a seal puller or a dull flathead screwdriver. With both tools, you position the end on the inside of the seal, being careful not to go too deep. You don't want to nick the metal seal surface. Then lightly leverage the seal out by moving the tool around the ends of the seal. Do not try to do one hard pull, just back it out smoothly. And with the seals out, there is an important note. If you plan on using WRX axles which require stub axles, do not order STI axle seals, they are too big. This is the STI axle seal versus the stub axle seal. The STI seal opening has a larger diameter, which will cause a major leak if you use stubs. Another note, these are directional seals. These vanes direct the gear oil back into the trans as the axle spins. You can actually see the R and L in case you took them out of the parts bag before reading the label. I ordered the whole stub kit from Flatirons Tuning, which is the easy button, plain and simple. If you order from them, tell them I sent you. To install the seals, I suggest using a seal installation tool. This particular seal goes in pretty easy by hand though, so that's how I did it. You can also use a socket to tap it in. And the first thing you want to do is lubricate the seal with gear oil, and then with the labeled end facing out, take both thumbs and press the opposite ends on the seal. Once it starts to seat, work it in a circular motion nice and easy until the face of the seal is flush with the mating surface. And you can feel flush better than you can see it. Now if you want to make sure it's perfect, I suggest getting the tool. And now we can install the axle stubs if you plan on using WRX axles. Coat the stubs and wire circlips with fresh gear oil. Install the circlips on the end of the stub. Now these can be a pain, but with a 28mm socket and with a little rotation and pressure you can work it on and slide it onto the groove. Then you're going to gently insert the stub axle into the differential with the pinhole side of the stub facing away from the transmission. Then you're going to rotate the stub to align the splines with the diff splines and push it in as far as you can. And once the stub axle stops, use a non-metal dead blow hammer to seat the stub. It doesn't take much force, and you will hear a very audible click from the circlip when it's fully seated. Once both sides are installed, rotate and tug the axle stubs to confirm proper fitment. Okay, so now we are moving to the shifter assembly and the bushings. I'm changing the upper shifter linkage to a solid metal unit opposed to a polymer dampened one. I have new polyurethane bushings for the lower linkage pivot, and there's a new adjustable short throw shifter that I'm putting in. And to top it off, I do have some OEM replacement parts as well. Before taking anything apart, I suggest marking the upper linkage because it's possible to get the orientation mixed up if you're not paying attention. I put a T here, so I know that that's the transmission side of the bushing that was facing up. To remove the shifter assembly, you will need to disconnect the reverse lockout cable from the shifter or transmission. I chose to remove it from the transmission because I'm replacing the lower link bushing, which has a bracket that also holds the cable. To disconnect the cable, find this linkage and push this retainer pin in this direction. This arm has to be lifted away from the pivot while pushing. With the cable disconnected, you can remove the entire shifter assembly by removing these 2 bolts. With the assembly out, I'm going to separate the upper and lower parts of the assembly. Then clean everything up and replace the items from left to right, one at a time. Don't torque down your bushings until everything is mounted back on the transmission. To separate the upper and lower parts, you will need to remove this snap ring from the lower shifter mount. Decent snap ring pliers make this 100 times easier. When you squeeze these ends together, the diameter will get smaller and you can lift the clip out. Just make sure you wear safety glasses because these are called snap rings because they snap into place and sometimes out of place, and they can get pretty dangerous. Once the snap ring is removed, you can move this bolt that holds the shifter lever to the upper link. The rubber gasket that separates the vehicle interior and exterior does not have to be completely removed. but you will have to remove this safety wire which holds the rubber gasket to the shifter lever cup if you want the upper and lower links to move relatively freely. With the assembly mostly dismantled, we can start cleaning and replacing parts. The upper shifter linkage is not a symmetrical part, so I take the old part and compare it to the new part. Here you can see that the pivots are not the same length and not welded at the center. With the T marking that I made, I can quickly identify the new assembly and how it should be oriented. And as you can see, the old bushings were pretty worn. Take the grease that was provided with the part or bearing grease and apply it to the main surfaces and pivot points. The direction the bolt faces does matter. You want the nut end of the bolt to face upwards so it doesn't interfere with the lower linkage. For the lower linkage bushings, you can press it in or pry it out. It's in there pretty tight because the OEM unit is a single piece. You have to work around the ends of the bushing while applying continuous pressure from the opposite end. Once it's out, lubricate the new bushings with the supply grease or silicone paste. Most aftermarket bushings are multiple pieces, so generously lubricate all the contact surfaces and slide the pieces into place, not forgetting to insert the metal guide through the center. I then cleaned out the shifter lever cup and put a healthy dose of bearing grease in it. I replaced the shifter lever cup because the plastic can get brittle and break if you expand it when you're replacing the shifter lever. It's held in by 2 rubber O-rings that I reused, and as you can see, I covered everything in a good amount of bearing grease. To install the cup, you have to insert the shift lever pivot ball in first. Then place the assembly back into the cup. Then you're going to install the snap ring. From there, you can clean or replace the shift lever linkage and or bushings. This is pretty straightforward to install. Just remember to lubricate the main and rotating surfaces. Put this bolt back in and you can move on if you're not replacing the shift lever. And I am replacing the shift lever. The hardest part about replacing the shift lever is the reverse lockout cable. It's not terrible, it's just kind of annoying. The cable is released from the shift lever by tapping out this roll pin. You'll need a small punch. I tap the punch out with a pair of pliers, so it doesn't take much effort. From there, the cables come out of the lever and you can disassemble the rest of the lever. And I suggest laying it out in order that you take it apart so you don't forget anything. Assemble the trim and reverse mechanism pieces in reverse order that they were disassembled. With these 2 bolts in place, install the reverse lockout cable with some fresh grease. Try not to over torque the bolts. You can tell if you did because the pivot points will not move freely. I torqued mine to where they were pretty stiff and then backed out half a turn. And then you're going to test all the gears including reverse. There is an output shaft seal on the tail end of the transmission. Check the splines for damage and look for signs of leakage. I didn't replace this because it looks like it's in pretty good shape. There are 2 drain plugs and a drain plug housing that should be checked and or refreshed. I'll clean and reseal the drain plug housing when the trans is mounted to the vehicle because it's easier to work on in my opinion in that position. In terms of bushings, there are 3 areas that can be replaced. There are 2 areas for cross member bushings and 1 mount that mounts the trans to the cross member. These don't require grease or much cleaning. To access them while on the ground, you will need to stand the transmission up on a dolly. Know that the input shaft peaks past the belt housing, so you will need some clearance. Do not try to stand it on a flat surface. Once it's standing, you can unbolt it as an assembly or take it apart piece by piece. I think it's easier to take off the assembly. The bushings are pretty straightforward to install. You just replace them and reassemble. The trans mount is just 4 bolts. Make sure you get the direction correct. Now keep in mind that if there's a torque spec, torque it to spec. Not just with this, but whenever working on your vehicle. And at this point, you can mount the cross member to the transmission. And the transmission will be ready mounted to the car. But there's still a good amount of work to do in terms of the swap overall. The list of external components that are the same between the 5 and 6 speed is pretty short. The vehicle speed sensor, the oxygen sensor wiring, and I think the stub axles. I noticed that some of the bolt-on components like the clutch fork and basic shifter components are also different. Now will they work if you transfer them? Maybe, but I'm just saying that they're not the same. Now unless I get a sponsor for a transmission, I will most likely use my WRX transmission in Dirty D, so I didn't take anything off of it for this swap. And the only thing I had to do electronically at this point is add this adapter harness. This takes a single 6-pin STI connector and splits it into a WRX 4-pin connector and a 2-pin connector that feeds the DCCD control module. and it's pretty accessible, so you can actually put it in with the vehicle fully assembled in my opinion. So now is the time to subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my playlist and my new website because they are all here for you, the team. Now let me know in the comments how your projects are going and if you have any questions. And with that being said, stay tuned and thanks for watching.